Hello, good afternoon, welcome. My name is Brenda Bruggencate. I'm with the Santa Fe Springs Department of Fire Rescue. Thank you, Dave, for your perspective from a contractor's point of view. Today I'll be giving you a perspective from the inspector's point of view. So I'm going to walk you through the process from permitting to inspections and cover the who, what, when, why, and where of underground tank closure. And I'm not here to tell you this is how it's done. I'm here to share with you my experience as a tank closure inspector. And if you take something away that's new or informative for you today, then I will consider my mission accomplished. Some of the other topics I'm going to cover are clean certifications, and we'll briefly touch on open excavations. So as you are all probably already aware, there are 3 types of underground storage tank closure. 2 are permanent, that's the in-place closure and removal, and temporary. We won't have time to get into the temporary closure portion of the presentation, but I have already uploaded the slides to the CUPA website. So if you're interested in that particular topic, you can go back and have a look at those later. And just a word of caution, more of defining terms. We keep talking about closure, but if you were to go to the underground tank cleanup track, the term closure would mean something very different. In fact, it's related more to the cleanup and remediation of tank sites and getting no further action letters or closure letters, if you will. But when we talk about closure here today, we're just talking about removing a tank, closing a tank in place. So I'll use those terms interchangeably. So where does an inspector begin to be involved with tank closure? Usually and hopefully it happens at the time of permit application. If that's not the case, then you would refer to your own agency's enforcement procedures and how to deal with that if people are pulling tanks without permits. And for everyone in the room, you cannot pull an underground tank without a permit. So let's say in this scenario, the contractor is submitting a permit to the inspector. Well, why are permits required? Well, the first reason is the law says you have to demonstrate as an underground storage tank owner or operator that you're going to comply with the law for that tank closure. And there are a lot of laws that apply. I'm a fire department and a CUPA, and so we have the Title 22 and Title 23 regulations that go along with that. The fire code, some agencies have their own fire code. LA City Fire Department has their own fire code. In Santa Fe Springs and a majority of places, we use the 2010 California Fire Code. But you have your health departments, your OSHA, air districts, and building departments that all have some kind of role in a tank closure. But today we're going to focus on the top 2 and talk about the CUPA and Fire Department requirements. So you need a permit because the fire code says you need to get one. Section 105.7.7 says if you're going to alter a tank, close a tank, abandon a tank in place, or temporarily close it, you need a permit. So what if you're not a fire agency? What if you're an environmental health department administering the CUPA program? Well, Title 23 says you need to apply for closure to your local implementing agency. But be aware of timelines because the time frame in which you can apply for closure can vary from agency to agency. The state regulations give the locals a lot of flexibility in terms of what they require for underground tank closure. So be aware in each jurisdiction you're in. So the regulations say that once the cessation of hazardous material storage has stopped, you have 90 days to apply for tank closure. But you have 30 days before you remove it or close it to give a plan to the local implementing agency. Well, there's a disconnect between these time frames and regulation, and most agencies want one application for tank closure. So check with your local agency, and as an inspector, you need to be informed of what those time frames are. So I'm not going to recite a whole bunch of code sections to you, but I will say in general terms that the rules we're dealing with that apply to tank closure are found in the Health and Safety Code, Article 7 of Title 23, the California Fire Code, and more specifically, your local ordinance. If you are a tank closure inspector and you have never read Article 7 of Title 23, you need to do that. It's very short. It's about 3 pages. It's simple to read. And it's surprisingly more specific than any other section in the Health and Safety Code or the Fire Code. So it covers what you need to do to any underground storage tank closure, what you need to do for temporary, permanent in place, and removal. It also dictates some of the sampling requirements, and we'll get into the specifics of that later. So let's look at the big picture. What are you looking for on a permit as an inspector? Well, you guys all probably have your own permit application. And why? Because the big picture is we need to track this tank. We need to know who the RPs are. A lot of that information is gathered on the state UST forms A and B, so if you simply ask for those to be submitted with the permit, you'll be accomplishing the tracking portion. It's also to ensure that you have a plan to ensure you're going to safely and legally address that tank closure, that the liquids are removed, that it's done in a safe manner, what your sampling plan is. You also want to make sure they submit a scaled map. I really want to stress the importance of having a scaled map. If you cannot get a scaled map, make sure that every tank and every line and every bend of that line has a dimension from that tanker pipe to 2 property lines, not to a building, but to property lines. Buildings come and go, property lines are less likely to change. And often when you actually go out to a tank removal job, the piping in the tank aren't anywhere near the original site map, so often what I do is conditionally approve all my tank closure permits that a scaled site map shall be submitted with the tank closure report, and I will reject that tank closure plan if that final drawing does not have scale or some point of reference to where 15 years from now, when this business owner wants to refi their property and the bank makes them do a phase 2, whether that station was closed out or not, you can go back with a fair degree of certainty and see where those elements are. So having a scaled plot plan is really important, especially being also on the cleanup side of things at the CUPA. We really rely on accuracy, so make sure you get that at some point during the tank closure process. Contractor licensing. When a contractor submits a permit, you want to make sure they're properly licensed. Those permits, as I mentioned, they can be agency specific. Some places have you submit a written work plan that describes each step of your tank closure, while others do it on prescriptive forms. In Santa Fe Springs, we have prescriptive forms that we attach conditions on how you're going to remove or close a tank in place or perform temporary closure. Personally, I love the prescriptive forms because it covers an overwhelming majority of the way that people close tanks anyway, and it allows us to give permit approval over the counter in 20 minutes. If we're receiving a written work plan for each and every tank removal, that can take a lot of time sitting down and reviewing it. At least we know when customers use our prescriptive forms, we know exactly what we can expect. We will allow them to deviate from those, though, if they want to do something different than what we've attached as conditions, then they can go ahead and submit a work plan and we'll review that for compliance. So contractor licensing. As an inspector, when you're reviewing the permit, you want to make sure they have the right license to pull the tank. Well, the State Water Board has put together a great local guidance letter. It's LG 48-5, and it talks about the acceptable types of licensing you can have to remove or close a tank. Now, you can have a Class A, B, C 36, C 61, or D 40, one of those, and the hazardous substance certification. So the LG contains the details on the description of the license and what they can do, but I've abbreviated down to my simple inspector ways. And when I see a Class A, I think of the word all, starts with A. If you have a Class A license, you can remove any tank for any purpose. A Class B, I think of building. If you're going to pull a tank or close a tank with a Class B contractor's license, you're going to be needing to be doing some modification to a building or constructing a building or have that tank be incorporated with some kind of service to the building. And then the C36s are good for service station removals. Now, service station doesn't start with C, but it sounds like C, so it's easy to remember. And then finally, the last one, the C61 D40 is for tanks under 20,000 gallons. So let's go back to our first slide. And instead of saying that this contractor's dropping off a permit application, it's been approved. Well, now what? As an inspector, you need to follow that permit and make sure they comply within a reasonable amount of time. And Title 23 lets that be determined by the local agency. So again, for all you contractors, you're stuck having to deal with the CUPA and what they decide is an appropriate length of time. In Santa Fe Springs, for an example, we give 6 months. However, with good reason, we'll extend you another 6 months, but we won't go past that. And why? Because we're a fire agency, and the fire code says for permanent closure, you have to take care of it in 1 year. That's it. There's no provisions for extensions. If it's temporary closure, fire code says you have to safeguard it in 90 days. So what's next? Well, Dave here will get on his bat phone and give us a call and say, we're ready for tank closure, usually tank removal. How you accept that notification is up to you. In this day and age, there's all kinds of ways we can get that notification. So what do you inspect for? I'm going to walk through the permanent closure requirements for removal first, because many of those requirements apply to closure in place as well. So if you look through the code or Title 23, you are not going to find any place that says, as an inspector, you shall inspect for this on an underground storage tank removal. Instead, what the fire code says is if there's a requirement in the fire code, you, as a fire code official, have the authority to inspect for that. Well, what does the fire code say about tank removal? It says you're going to remove the contents, you're going to inert the tank, you're going to remove the piping, you're going to remove the tank if this is for tank removal. In Title 23, that's a little bit more beat around the bush kind of authority. It says the UST owner-operator has to demonstrate to the local authority that no unauthorized releases have occurred, and that needs to happen by soil or water sampling. So right there, if you're an environmental health agency that's a CUPA, you have your authority to go on site and witness soil samples. You also have the right to ask them to prove to you how that tank's being disposed. What better way to prove that than being on site and watching it come out of the ground? Where your inspection authority really lies is what you describe in the UST closure permit and in your ordinance. In Santa Fe Springs, we wrote our UST closure permit and adopted it by ordinance. So before you even arrive on a site as an inspector, read the permit. A lot of agencies have one person approving the permit and a different inspector going out to the site. Be knowledgeable, know the conditions, know what the sampling requirements are. When I arrive on site, I expect the geologist to know what the sampling requirements are, and we should be equally as responsible. So before I even park my car and I'm driving up to the site, I'm scanning the address I'm arriving to for this tank closure, and I'm looking for things to be aware of, primarily traffic hazards. Dave spoke about this a little bit. I personally feel, as an inspector, I also do emergency response for the city, my greatest fear is not 2 parts per billion of benzene. It is getting run over by a car or earth-moving equipment or maybe falling in a sump, not paying attention. So pay attention, be aware of your surroundings, protect yourself first. What's the access in and out? Is there a lot of space, or is it a tight, busy street, urban gas station? How many people are in the removal area? Do you have a bunch of looky-loos from the business that want to see the tank come out of the ground, and they rush right to the corner of the excavation without having any safety training, no hard hats, they don't know the condition of the excavation, and the asphalt they're standing on is breaking away from sloughing of soil underneath? You need to be aware of those people and quickly segregate them. Look at your overhead hazards. Dave had a great slide of electrical lines and your crane. As the boom moves, is there any chance that it might get close to that? Because it doesn't have to touch. It just needs to come close. It can arc. Also be aware of any underground electrical and gas lines. You also want to project what you envision the path of that tank to be once it's pulled out of the ground and it moves over to the transportation truck. Is it passing over an office building? Is it passing just over some asphalt? Pick the safest path of travel for that tank to get to that transportation truck. So plan ahead and use common sense, because it doesn't really tell you this in the regulations that we administer. So let's look at this photograph here. I apologize to those of you on, is this still working? Can you still hear me? Can you hear me now? This is a site that I arrived on, and the first thing that I see that makes me very happy is there is a lot of space here. To lay the logistics of this photograph out, this red line, I feel like I'm shouting because when I turn away, the microphone's on the wrong side. This red line over here is a curb on the street corner. And in the foreground on the left is the driveway to the property. So as I first pull up, I notice this is great. There's a lot of space. I'm going to park to the left outside of this picture and stay out of the way. So when this transportation truck that has a bed that's going to be towing the tank out of the way has a clear path to get out, and the stupid inspector doesn't have to go move their car because they're in the way. The next thing that I see is there's not very many people on this job site, which is a good thing. You don't need a lot of observers. These gentlemen here, the construction workers, they're wearing hard hats, safety vests. It's also noted when I arrived on this site, they asked me to sign their site entry log, which I really appreciate. To me, that shows that this company cares about safety. I've also pulled up on job sites where there's tons of people standing right here at the edge of the excavation, and none of the employees have any kind of protective clothing on. To me, that's a gauge of how much attention I need to pay to this tank removal throughout the process. Do they need to be closely monitored, or indicators that they're pretty conscientious? So in the next slide, you'll see the remainder of this truck bed. And I'm just going to talk briefly about the pathway out of this excavation. These electrical lines are actually much further away than they look. They're in this business behind here in the white building. So that wasn't a hazard. But instead of coming this way over the truck, all things being equal, it came around the back side. And I know it's difficult to see this from the back, but between the tank and the truck bottom, there's just piles of backfill covered with plastic. You know, why take a chance? Bring it around the back way in the safe way. The other thing I see here is there's a lot of distance between the end of this tank and the back of this truck bed. I've seen in the past where truck beds say that the bed is flat all the way across here and there's not this step. This tank is going down here. But there's some truck beds where it's flat right up against the back of the truck, and this employee, in the course of trying to maneuver the tank to lay flat onto this bed and position it right, gets sandwiched, you know, a few feet in between the tank and the back of the truck. All it takes is for the crane operator to bump the crane the wrong way and have that tank swing, and you have a construction worker pancake. You know, why take the risk when it can easily be avoided? So at this point, I've parked my car. When I get out, the first thing I want to do is talk to the supervisor on site. I want to know who's on site and what their roles are. We talked about those looky-loos. Make sure they're at a safe distance. They're free to watch, but make sure they're not in any of the way where the equipment is moving. I also want to talk to the geologist. I want to know who's cleaning or certifying the tank is clean, and who the site safety officer is. For me, one of the most important things to know is who the site safety officer is. Because if I see something that makes me uncomfortable, perhaps where a person is standing, perhaps there's something that's making you uncomfortable with the way this is going, and you can't quite specifically place it in a regulation or a code, I'll go to the site safety officer and I'll say, hey, do you realize your employee is in that pit? And I'll let them make a determination, and usually they'll have them come out, or in the cases where I've been challenged, I've always asked to say, well, can you show me in your health and safety plan where it allows them to do that? And often they'll change their mind. In extreme cases, I'll just share with you a story. It was actually on a tank installation, but one of the employees, he jumped in the pit. There was two 12,000-gallon underground tanks being installed in an excavation, and he jumped in right in between the two tanks because he wanted to push the one away a little bit more. And I asked the contractor, I said, you know, you have a guy in confined space. And he goes, oh, he's not going to be that long. And I said, well, would you mind asking him to come out? He just needs to move it over a little bit. And I said, well, can you show me where that is in your health and safety plan? And he just kind of fumbled, and finally, I was getting a little frustrated. I took out my phone. I said, here's my phone. You call OSHA. If you can get an inspector to tell me this man's allowed to be in this excavation, I'll let you do it. Otherwise, I'm going to walk off site. So you can fix it, or you can take this phone call. And, of course, he fixed it. So sometimes you have to pull out the bitch card. Excuse me. Okay. So still the tank's not out. You're on site. You're talking to people. Ask the contractor, where are they in the removal process? Because if they're still trying to get the LELs down on a tank that they're cleaning, you don't want to hang around for another hour unless you're in a really remote area and there's nowhere to go anyways. Just a tip for you inspectors, I always bring extra work with me in the car in case there's a delay. There's no need to just sit there and do nothing. So I just make that a practice on every tank pull that I go to. Ask them where they are in the process. Is the tank ready to be certified by your qualified person? We come on site when the interior atmospheric readings are being taken for the underground storage tank. Ask your agency, where do you want to be present? When do you want to come on in site? That's specified in our tank closure permit. It specifically says the Santa Fe Springs Fire Department inspector shall witness the clean certification of the tank. You also want to verify the information they submitted to you on the permit. This supervisor that you're talking to, is he from the company who pulled the permit? Is there a different contractor there than applied for the permit? Well, that's a point of great pause. You want to put the brakes on there because you never check their contractor licensing. You don't know that they know the work plan. This is somebody else's work plan. So as an inspector, you can call the job off, or if you'd like, if things seem to be going well and they're able to demonstrate to you that they have proper licensing, et cetera, and that they understand the work plan, if you're a really kind, generous inspector and comfortable with it, that's the main thing, you could go ahead and let them modify the existing permit and come back to your office and pay for the permit addendum later, because you can always hold them hostage for a closure letter if they don't pay for that. Just an idea, but if you're ever uncomfortable with it, by all means, you have every right to call the job off, because a good contractor should know if they don't pull the permit, they need to file a permit addendum with the local agency. So I'll go over and talk to the tank driver and say, where are you transporting this truck? Title 22 says, if you have a tank, you have to inform the local agency of the destination of that tank and whether it's intended for reuse or recycle. So I'll ask the tank driver, or the driver that's hauling the tank, where are you taking this tank? We have it listed on our permit. I'll compare the notes, see if it's the same. If it's different, in terms of sending it to a different recycling center, that's not a big deal. We'll just modify that, make a note on the permit. But if it's for reuse and they said it was going for recycle, a lot of agencies don't allow underground tanks to be reused. So first you need to see if your agency allows it. But also if you do, you need to collect the name of the location it's going to and the address it's going to and what the intended use is. And as the inspector, you should mail a copy of that information to the jurisdiction that this tank is going to. So make sure you record on the permit any instances at the site that are different than what you know they should be. At this point, I would ask the contractor, well, what are the logistics of the tank removal? How is it coming out? What direction are you going? And at that point, I just want to make sure that there's safe egress for the tanker truck that holds the rinsate. Where is the tank hauling truck going? Does it seem like a safe path where they're going to move the tank? I'll also take a look at the crane, or sometimes it's a backhoe, and see, is the size of that crane appropriate for the kind of tank they want to pull? And what are the conditions of the lifting cables? Have any of you had the displeasure of being on a tank removal where the cables or lifting straps have broke? Okay, so there's several hands. Actually, there's more hands than I was expecting to be raised. But let me tell you, it's a scary thing. I had the good fortune of being on a very, very bad tank removal super early on in my career where nobody got hurt. And what happened was they were lifting a 30,000-gallon double-walled tank out of an excavation. And if I was more experienced at that time, I would have been able to look at that backhoe and say, that's not reasonable, and sent them on their merry way to go get a bigger crane. But the condition of their lifting straps, they started to lift that tank. The tank got about 3 foot above the excavation, and that sucker broke. And when they break, they don't fall nicely into the excavation. They go flinging like a boomerang, and you want to make sure that you're not going to be in the way if something like that happens. So when I talk about lifting the tank and just simple things as avoiding going over cars or buildings, when there's an alternative means and there's no obstructions on the ground, take the safer route. An ounce of prevention goes a long way. Okay, so the excavation. It's important to take a look at the excavation as an inspector because not all soils are created equal. In the photograph on the right here, whoopsie, this is the laser pointer here. If you look in the background, the sidewalls are vertical, the soil's very firm, it's a stiff clay, and nothing's sloughing off. Standing on the edge of that concrete there would probably be relatively safe. However, if you look at the photograph on the left, this is a very loose, unconsolidated material. There's lots of pea gravel and sand. And if you look at the right of this picture, you can even see that the soil is sloughing off from underneath the concrete. Fortunately, this contractor observed the nature of this soil and put a safety fence around it, so we didn't have to worry about people getting too close to it. But the minute a tank comes out of the ground, the first inclination is for everybody to run over to the edge, have a look, let's look inside. Well, of course you want to do that, but before you do, stop and look around and make sure you're not standing on a piece of concrete that has nothing underneath it for 2 feet because the soil has sloughed away. Okay, so look around. Do you have any other concerns? Talk with the site safety officer about it before the tank actually comes out of the ground. You know, if you can't resolve the matter as a fire code official, you have stop work authority in section 111.11 of the California Fire Code. But stop work authority has a whole process that goes along with it. There's some paperwork that you need to do. But what if you're not a fire authority official? What if you're environmental health CUPA? You have an ace in your pocket. You can not sign off the permit. You can walk off the job site. And if you walk off the job site and you haven't witnessed the proper disposal of that tank or the soil sampling, you could potentially not approve it and just tell those folks, you know, you're going to have to reschedule it another time. It gets cooperation. I also want to talk to the geologist. When I walk up to the geologist, I expect them to know the sampling plan. We prescribe those in the permit before we issue them. It's nothing we're going to decide in the field. It's decided. Read the permit, know the requirements, make sure the geologist does. If they don't know, I'm going to spend more time with that person. Make sure they have the right type of sampling equipment. My jurisdiction is under the Los Angeles Regional Water Quality Control Board, and they require EPA Method 5035 for any kind of volatiles. You know, those little Encore samples or the sodium bisulfate. And if they don't have that, if you're in a rural area, sometimes they have time to run and get them and bring them back before it's time to start doing the sampling. Urban area, I'm sorry, I said rural. In rural areas, it might not work as successfully, but a lot of times by reviewing that on the front end and allowing them the time to go get that, by the time the tanks come out and we're ready to sample, the correct equipment has arrived on site. So the other thing is to make sure that they have ice in their ice chest. And fortunately, again, I'm in an urban area. If they don't have it, they can run to the corner local liquor store and get a bag of ice. Or if you have extra dry ice from the inerting process, perhaps you can chip some of that off, stick it in your ice chest, allow it to get going and cool, and then you can put your samples in there. And then you also want to review the chain of custody. Do they have their chain of custody with them? If they don't have a chain of custody, they're done. They need to have one. Those samples legally have to be under chain of custody from the time they're collected all the way until the lab analyzes them. And at the end of the job, I also want to review it to make sure it's filled out correctly. Because there's nothing worse to get a tank closure report and see that they didn't do the proper analysis. It's like they're stuck having to go back out there again when they could have done it right the first time. And I just feel bad for the business because basically the contractor screwed up.